And welcome to another edition of Israeli Frenemies. My name is Josh Haston, Middle East correspondent for JNS News, also radio host on the Land of Israel network. With me today is Angela Godfrey-Goldstein, an Israeli peace activist. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And before we get started, I just have to say I have a heavy heart following the terrorist murder of a good friend of mine, Ari Fold. It's due to Ari, really, that I'm here on the show. ILTV and Israeli Frenemies found me through Ari. And ironically, 10 hours before Ari was murdered savagely about a month ago, he sent me a message letting me know that he thought I did a great job on that week's show of Israeli Frenemies. So he is truly missed. He is missed by all. Now we'll get to the show. Thank you. The first topic today is Gaza. At about 3:30 in the morning the other night, my phone started beeping with the red alert application. Terrorists from Gaza fired a rocket which scored a direct hit on a house in Beersheba. Luckily, a mother and 3 children took the precaution of running to the security room. Their house was destroyed, but nobody was injured. Just a few minutes ago, the Security Cabinet in Israel instructed the IDF to step up its response to the terror attacks, to the violent riots on the Gaza border. At the same time, the Security Cabinet says a truce with Hamas is possible. So we'll start with you, Angela. Your thoughts on the latest escalation coming out of Gaza.
Okay. I yesterday had a conversation with Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, whom I think you probably know. And he had just got back from Gaza. And I said, how is Gaza? I don't know how many people you know living in Gaza, but I do know quite a few. And he said, Gaza is just hell. And he said, when I suggested that maybe we were now going to step up our incursion or attacks, he said, yes, if this is going towards elections, then they are buying their election power on our blood. And that is the perception from the other side. The people in Gaza, I think, you may disagree, are in an open-air prison. They do not have the ability to feed themselves. The children are dying. Child mortality rates, we know, it's very obvious, and it was in yesterday's Haaretz. Child mortality rates from the bad water are very high. I would suggest we left when we disengaged because we'd used up all the water. And the children and the others are drinking sewage, salt, oil, pesticides, and fertilizers as a toxic cocktail. So what do I think about Gaza? Yes, I believe it's an open-air prison. I do believe we're occupying it according to international law, and de facto it is besieged. You can talk about the Egyptians on that border, but basically we control the airspace, the water access is barred, they can't go out fishing, they can't export, and their lifestyle, I know from the people that I speak to in Gaza, is horrendous.
Let's focus on the fact that in 2007, Hamas took over Gaza, and instead of utilizing the humanitarian aid, which Israel sends in on a daily basis, tons and tons of humanitarian aid, Hamas takes that aid, takes it over and uses it towards manufacturing the weapons tunnels. We saw yesterday the IDF destroyed another weapons tunnel and uses it for their rocket manufacturing. They're actually committing a double war crime, Hamas, by hiding behind women and children, firing their rockets at Israeli civilians, as we saw in Beersheba the other day. So this is a double war crime. It's not the Israeli blockade, if using your terminology, in Gaza, which is causing the problem. What's causing the problem is a Hamas evil terror regime that people have to remember. These are the same people that blew up buses and cafes in Jerusalem in 2002 through 2005. If Hamas would actually care about their people and use the humanitarian aid provided by Israel for the purpose of their civilians and the well-being of the civilians, there wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that Hamas is hijacking that aid and using it to continue to attack Israel. And that's really why you have a situation you do down there in Gaza.
Okay, I hear this. Everything you've said is not new to me. I reject it, and I will say why. On the one hand, we allowed Hamas funding to get to them in the 80s as a means of divide and rule between them and Fatah. So we are actually very much responsible for the growth of Hamas. When we sent 400 of them from our prisons up to Lebanon, we gave them more or less an open-air university with trainings from Iran. This we know. It was a failure. It was a bad policy. Why did Hamas come to power? They won the elections. Why did they win the elections? Because they were seen to be standing up against the occupation. Oslo did not deliver peace because, largely from the viewpoint of Palestinians, the settlements trebled in numbers.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but Hamas won the municipal or the local elections and then took over violently. I remember the scenes of them throwing Fatah members off the roofs in 2007, and that's when they took over. So, I mean, what I think now should happen is Israel has to stop with this humanitarian aid. You know why? Because I think Israel, unfortunately, is enabling Hamas. So I might disagree with what you said in terms of Israel helped Hamas come to power, but certainly now what Israel is doing by enabling Hamas by sending in the humanitarian aid. What I would do instead, and I've seen the situation in other conflicts around the world, I would say to Hamas once and for all, we're not sending any more humanitarian aid. We're turning off the electricity. If Egypt wants to deal with it, let Egypt deal with it. But Israel has to stop enabling them. I'm also, by the way, again, sending troops, IDF troops, into Gaza. I don't want to fight a war for Mahmoud Abbas so that Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah can go ahead and take over the Gaza Strip. I think the people of Gaza, they're the ones who should wake up and realize the reality that Hamas is destroying their lives, and I put the onus on Hamas.
Hamas won the election in Gaza. They won because they were seen not to be corrupt and they were standing up against our occupation. And in your framing, Josh, you're not referring to the occupation, and you're not referring to our policies, which are creating enemies. And therefore, when Baruch Goldstein deliberately tried to derail Oslo and was largely successful, he killed 29 Palestinians at prayer in the Ibrahimi Mosque, the Cave of the Patriarchs, during Ramadan. That's when the bus bombing policy started. If you check the records, you will see. Until then, Hamas had not been attacking civilians. But that was something we started. Similarly, when Yigal Amir killed Rabin, that was done also in order to derail peace. And we have never gone back to that. So when you're talking about humanitarian aid, which is minimal, they are not free. We have not tried to make peace. We are not seen to be in good faith. They are seen to be the only people standing up against us. And therefore, all we are doing, and I think we can agree on this, we do neither of us approve of Hamas dropping people off sixth-floor buildings, etc., obviously. All we are doing is strengthening them in the West Bank. The people in Gaza, from what I hear, they're fed up with Hamas and they wish that they had a more liberal, open, free lifestyle.
Again,
but the question, just one second, please.
Sure.
The question is, what sort of a future are you planning for Israel in your head? What are your policies, such as stopping...
We've had several major deadly terror attacks here in Israel over the last several weeks. We had my friend Ari Fold, who was murdered by terrorists in Gush Etzion a month ago, and then you had two others murdered in the Barkan industrial zone. The IDF and Israel have a policy of destroying the homes of the terrorists. Now, this is a drawn-out policy. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to have approval by the Supreme Court until it actually gets done. So the question we're discussing today is, are home demolitions an effective deterrent in order to prevent the next attack? In my opinion, I think, unfortunately, as a result of the situation where the IDF relies on the courts and it takes so long to actually carry out these home demolitions, I think that is less of a deterrence. If it's up to me, if I was in charge, I would say the families of the terrorists should be immediately deported from the country, whether it's sending them to Gaza or sending them to dropping them off somewhere else in the Middle East. We need to create a serious deterrence here. Home demolitions are not enough, in my opinion. Your thoughts?
I worked for 9 years with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and I can tell you that our policies create conditions in which terror thrives. That's my opinion, and that's borne out by the statistics. If you look at the number of terrorist attacks, home demolitions are usually in the background of those families. So all we are doing is creating enemies. We're teaching people to hate us. And I think that by our zoning and planning policies, which are forcing people off their own land, in East Jerusalem, for example, only 10% of East Jerusalem that we added on in 1967 is available for Palestinian building because of being zoned. 36% was zoned for Jewish settlements, 54% or so for open green space or land reserves, and therefore the Palestinians can almost never legally build. They build illegally, and then they have to watch their life savings disappear in demolitions. I'm working now with Bedouin in the village of Al-Khan al-Ahmar, which you've probably heard about. It is up for demolition, the whole village and the school, which I helped to fund and build in 2009. These are war crimes. Why are they war crimes? Because we have signed the Geneva Convention, because international law, whether it's the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, or indeed the 2334, the UN Security Council resolution, has said so. So we're going against our own word.
Let's remember, though, that the terrorist who murdered my friend Ari Fold came from Yatta. Yatta is a village under Area A, under complete Palestinian Authority control, both from security and from a municipal perspective. So Arabs in Area A can build freely. That's not the issue here. The issue here is how to create deterrence. We're talking about Arabs who are coming from these areas, from the Hebron area, under complete PA control, and are managing to murder our civilians and are trying to murder our soldiers on an almost daily basis. You know, yesterday, near where I live in Gush Etzion, a school bus was pelted with rocks. Thank God none of the children. This is a deliberate attack on children carried out by Arabs, not under Hamas, living under the Palestinian Authority. So I think instead, though, of home demolitions, which I think aren't effective enough, I would say Israel has to do much, much more. In addition to tearing down the house immediately, you know, I studied psychology, and there was always they would always say, you know, when parents were punishing their children, the mother would say, oh, don't you wait and you'll see when your father comes home what's going to happen to you. Now, what happens in between that period when the kid does something wrong and the father comes home? The kid forgets. He doesn't realize, you know, what he has done. That's absolutely, positively wrong. So Israel must destroy the homes. It must happen faster, number one. And number two, we have to create a deterrence where these terrorists will think twice, knowing the repercussions of their actions of murdering Israelis. I know that there is a pay-for-slay program under the PA, and they get money for murdering Israelis, but Israel has to create a stronger deterrence, not just home demolitions. We have to go much, much further, in my opinion.
Ari, your policies, Josh, sorry,
yeah.
And your, because you mentioned Ari three times, and
so it's hard. This is the chair he sat in for years.
I understand.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
I think we both care enormously about all of that. I'm not somebody that hates Israel or is a self-hating Jew.
God forbid.
And I studied Kabbalah for many years. And therefore, I have to tell you, if your heart isn't at the center of what you're doing, and if you are not a truth seeker, the chances are the fruit will be rotten. And what you're proposing, deterrence and this, people want to be treated decently. You talk about Area A, it's closed off to the Palestinian police from 1 in the morning till 6 so that the army is free to go in. And the occupation in Area C under full Israeli control is so severe. That is the support system for A and B. They see the settlements growing. They know that we control the water. You're from Gush Etzion, Ariel Block, Jordan Valley, that's the water. They do not have access to water.
So you're saying they have a reason for terrorism?
Oh, I'm saying that what I said earlier, very clearly, I hope, is that our policies create conditions in which terror thrives. We are not trying to make peace. We're trying to take all of it.
Number one,
and they know that and see it.
You mentioned Gush Etzion. I'd like to invite you to the relative coexistence that we do have, where Arabs can shop with Jews together, and they can drive freely. You can drive freely from Beit Lechem to Hebron without seeing one ID of soldier. And I mentioned before the Barkan Industrial Zone, where Arabs earn Israeli salaries there, and there are these pockets of coexistence which do exist, and Arabs can actually benefit from Israel and would rather live, if they were telling the truth, they'd rather. we're going to talk now about Bolivia. Why Bolivia, you might ask? Well, Bolivia, the country of Bolivia, has invited the Israeli NGO B'Tselem to a session of the UN Security Council, where they will address the plenum there on Thursday in New York. And B'Tselem, of course, is an organization dedicated to bashing Israel, bashing the IDF. They filed numerous reports accusing Israel of war crimes, accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. So as Ambassador Danny Danon, our wonderful ambassador in New York representing Israel in the UN, said, this is a travesty for B'Tselem to have a platform knowing their positions are completely anti-Israel, of course claiming that they're an Israeli organization, and their funding, of course, comes from many European Union countries. I think it's a disgrace that B'Tselem is giving. You know, the UN is bad enough without B'Tselem invited to bash Israel. I think it's bad enough. So why have them there in the first place? Why have they been invited by Bolivia, which actually refers to IDF soldiers as murderers? Why have they been invited to address the UN Security Council?
Okay, so I would ask you, what does human rights mean to you? Because when you say bashing Israel, I've been a human rights activist for 4 years living in Egypt, in Sinai. And I knew that my life was at stake, but it was stuff that seemed important to do. Why? Because you're warning of problems that lead to death and to war, okay? Now, B'Tselem, I believe, is doing an amazing job. They are dealing with an occupation. You don't talk about that. You say bashing Israel. Why is B'Tselem doing this? When I was at the Human Rights Council a few years ago, all of the panel, the committee, was asking the Israeli delegation, every year you come here and you talk about setting up an Israeli human rights organization, and every year you don't. Do you believe human rights should be enforced by Israel and not have to call on the EU and other donors to fund it?
You mentioned occupation. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe the town of Sderot is under occupation? This town of Sderot on the Gaza border. Is that under occupation?
No, it's an Israeli city.
Right, but the problem is that when Hamas was attacking us in 2014, on Hamas radio, they would say, we are now going to fire rockets, and they were proud, with Allah's help, we're going to fire rockets into the Israeli settlement of Sderot. In other words, what I'm saying is it doesn't matter if you live...
I said so, but
no,
you're not answering my question.
But if you,
do you value human rights,
of course,
Josh?
I value human rights.
Why?
But if you live in Haifa, if you live in Jaffa, if you live in Gush Etzion, it doesn't make a difference to the PA. It doesn't make a difference to Hamas. It makes a huge difference to the PA. And I personally, just this week, translated for a minister of the PA to an Israeli what he was saying and the message he wanted to convey. And that was, we want peace. We haven't, in Khan al-Ahmar, thrown a single stone, shot a single gun, done I've seen pictures of stones thrown from Khan al-Ahmar.
I'm talking about now, and I want to see those pictures because I don't believe them. I've worked there for the last 8 or 9 years,
after the
if
show,
not more.
Gladly show you the pictures. I'll have them sent.
But here and now, during the demonstrations that are going on, they have not one Molotov cocktail. They are non-violent. They are preaching non-violence. Even one of my friends, when he was in prison for throwing a stone, which he didn't throw, but it was a better deal if he did a plea bargain and got out of prison in a month rather than staying in for a year to wait for a trial. So he was teaching non-violence to even people like Marwan Barghouti in prison. Because the Palestinians...
Who's a murderer, who's a convicted murderer, Marwan Barghouti. But we're going off topic here because we want to talk about B'Tselem and their activity today in the UN. I'm all for human rights, but what B'Tselem does is they issue phony reports. I've seen copies of their reports in which they skew the information they're given, and they use them to bash the IDF. They went along with the Goldstone report back in 2009 against Israel, against the IDF, and then Richard Goldstone, he actually renounced his own report.
No, he didn't. He was having a very hard time, and he said,
B'Tselem, he used B'Tselem's evidence, I think it was 59 times in that report, and then after the 2014 war in Gaza, they used the B'Tselem evidence against the IDF. So this is an organization that's funded by Europe, to bash Israel and the IDF.
What Judge Goldstone said was, if I knew then what I know now, my report would have been different. But the other two investigators did not renounce it, did not renege on it, and yes, there were war crimes carried out. And if you want to play the victim, and we are victims, I agree with you, but they are the greater victims, the death rate is at least 10 to 1.
So you can't use numbers. You can't use numbers. If somebody comes and robs a house...
You've 3 times talked about your friend.
If somebody comes and robs a house...
Let's get back to B'Tselem. As far as
Okay.
B'Tselem is concerned, yes, it is an international issue. Yes, it is something that is part of the world order. We have signed the Geneva Conventions, as I said earlier. We have obligations, and we are absolutely reneging on them. So I don't think he has been left, Haggai Elad and the others in B'Tselem, with any options but to go to a higher court than our Supreme Court. If you say that the B'Tselem reports are fake, you'd have to ask them and get the proof from them. I'm not the right address for that.
If you consider the UN Security Council or the UN in general a fair and honest broker when it comes to Israel, then perhaps you haven't seen how much attention they've diverted towards Israel over the since their existence,
yes,
really.
Yes, of course I have, because we've got the longest running occupation in the world.
Bashing the Jewish state of Israel
Yeah,
time and time again, where atrocities, you talk about human rights, look what's going on in Syria. Why isn't anybody stepping up for half of...
Everybody's talking about
No, why? I want to
Syria.
talk about them because they're victims there. There are people dying there, being murdered there. 500,000 people.
Now for the good word. I've lived with Bedouin for over 20 years, and it's about freedom. We have a lot to learn from them, and the question is, are we Israelis interested in our own freedom, and can we be free if other people are not? And I suggest we should learn from the Bedouin because they are people of desert, and as the world goes into increasing climate change, we need their wisdom. So let's at least learn and open our hearts and try to look at the future a little bit more positively.
And I'm going to take this to a totally different place. Last night on the court in the NBA in the United States, you had two Israeli players represented. You had Omri Caspi on the Memphis Grizzlies and TJ Leaf, also an Israeli, on the Indiana Pacers. I, of course, am a huge Indiana Pacer fan. But anyway, it's great to see that two stars who were born here in the state of Israel, who played basketball, are now bringing their game to the greatest basketball league in the world, representing the blue and white proudly on the courts of the NBA, on the hardwood. So I wish TJ Leaf and Omri Caspi much success. Let them stay healthy and both have wonderful seasons representing Israel there in the U.S. And thanks for joining us on another edition of Israeli Frenemies here on ILTV. Don't miss a minute. Catch all the news from ILTV. Catch all the great shows that ILTV has to offer. Have a great week.